Hello, everybody. Welcome to The Underneath. I'm Kale Zeldin, your host, and I wanted to talk to you today about an idea that I've been trying to talk about on X, and it is once again popular in this little corner, and that is this notion of kayfabe. I made an attempt the other day to talk about kayfabe as not so much being fake, but rather some kind of scripted, participatory, meaning generating activity. And because that's been sort of floating around in my head, I was struck by the conversation between John Vervaeke, Jordan Hall, and Jordan B. Peterson on Jordan B. Peterson's um, channel the other day, and I think it was called, a dialogue so dangerous it just might bring you to wisdom. And there's been a lot of sort of ha ha ha, chuckle moments because once again, Jordan is not the best interviewer in the world, and when he and John Vervaeke start going. Finding some Dio logos with each other, it might be pretty hard to get a word in edgewise. And I think Jordan Hall figured that out, and he's gracious about it and kind. And I know John was a little bit embarrassed by the whole thing, but that's okay. And I think as the conversation progressed, it got better, and Jordan Hall was able to get in some, I think, good uh, framing moments that helped uh, them make some kind of sense. At any rate, in that conversation, there was a story that Jordan Hall notes about his own childhood, and Peterson was asking him. This is good Peterson, where he's asking him questions on, well, how basically how did you become the man you are now? Like what happened in your childhood? And Jordan Hall tells a great little story about growing up with sort of one of those sort of classic American neighborhoods with a woods on the outskirts of the neighborhood, and the woods sort of function as a place of play. They function actually, if you're sort of making the comparison to literature, they function as a kind of sacred grove, and for the child, nothing is more sacred than play. And I want to make a connection between this notion of the sacred grove and play and a sandbox with what is going on with kayfabe. And to be clear, uh, I I don't want to get sort of too hung up on the image of kayfabe itself and what's going on in a professional wrestling match and all of that. I think that's an interesting historical uh, inquiry. But for my purposes, I really want to look at the way kayfabe manifests itself in our lives. All those many of us who are not professional wrestlers, but we engage in participatory, scripted meaning making. And so Jordan Hall tells this great story. And of course, what happens to the sacred grove is it gets cut down and it is uh, used to build an ugly office park, ugly buildings, something like that. And this was sort of part of Jordan Hall's awakening to something is not quite right with the adult world. And it was in this that he recognized the need for some kind of a quest, right? So, anyway, at the very end of this conversation, and I'm going to share this with you all, at the very end, they start making a comparison between the Old Testament and the notion of hospitality. And I wanted to play it for you because, as a longtime English teacher, as soon as I hear the word hospitality, of course, my mind goes to the Greeks, and especially it goes to the Odyssey, because the Greek word for hospitality is xenia, Zenia, sorry, Xenia, and xenia is this expectation of hospitality, and uh, it is sort of tightly governed by rules, both for the host, but significantly also for the guest. right? So both parties engage in this, you might call it an elaborate handshake. And it has a particular salience in the Odyssey because it was this handshake, this sort of elaborate ritual, liturgical interaction between stranger and host, guest and host, that would mark you as essentially a civilized human being, not a pirate, not a marauder. That makes sense in the scope of the Odyssey, because one of the things that Odysseus has to learn in his return from the Trojan, his delayed return from the Trojan War, is that he needs to learn how to be a human being again, and all of what that means. So without further delay, I'm going to mute myself, and I'm going to bring you to Jordan Hall, John Vervaeke, and Jordan B. Petersons.
Which is where we are.
Yeah. Okay. So partly what we're trying to do here, and I would say in the broadest possible sense, I think this is what you're trying to do, John, and correct me if I'm wrong, is we've been investigating the propositionalization of an ethos that would unite iteratively and relatively permanently. And we're investigating the possibility that that must by necessity be predicated on something other than that immediate hedonic gratification. And it's also not predicated on power. Okay, so one of the things you see in the Old Testament.
Hold on 1 second.
Yep.
I think that was very powerful and very important. So in case other people besides us are participating in this conversation, put a bookmark on that.
Yeah.
So I did just put a bookmark on that because I want to participate in this conversation. And of course, any of you who have hung around in this little corner or in John Vervaeke space or Paul Vanderklay, this notion of participatory engagement, participatory knowing, of course, in the Vervaeke scheme of the 4 Ps of knowing, is such an important part of something that we have lost collectively as sort of a loose group, right? We have lost the participatory notion of knowing. And so here I am participating in Jordan Hall's, put a pin on it.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of exploration summarized very quickly in that statement.
Yep.
There's an immense emphasis in the Old Testament on the value of hospitality, right? Like it's a cardinal moral virtue. Now, I investigated that a little bit in We Who Wrestle with God anthropologically. I mean, part of the reason for that was, well, imagine that there are relatively isolated cities and a stranger comes in with wares to trade. Now, you can steal his wares, but you don't get any more like stuff. And so that's a drag. But worse than that, you don't know who he's associated with. Like the primates that we're related to are very good at remembering who each little primate they could pound flat.
Always makes me laugh that Jordan always goes back to primates. I always go back to the Greeks, right? And then sort of the thing we have in common is the Old Testament. We keep going back. But I think the Greeks offer us an insight. And in fact, the Odyssey as a story offers us exactly this kind of insight, because what Odysseus does on his way home is that he acts as a kind of, pirate. And so these sort of trade routes that Jordan will talk about, and then Vervaeke will pick this up too. The trade routes are not just for goods and services, but also for information. And I do think that that's an important insight.
Is related to, right? Because you pound the little primate flat and then his 3 more powerful relatives come along and you're dead. So they see the little guy in its social web. Okay, so the stranger's there and you could be very inhospitable, but then his army comes marching in and you're all dead, right? Plus, you don't get to trade, plus you're all dead. Yes, that's a bad idea. So now you have to be hospitable, and that gets the trade going. And so I'm wondering, then I was thinking about hospitality, like it's a local thing, right? Because that's what you do at a banquet or at a party. You make people welcome. That's what you do if you run a small business. If you have even the least amount of sense, you make people welcome. Then you could think if that's scaled, well, then the whole world would be a hospitable place and the problem would be solved, right?
So if it scales, right, and this is exactly the question, right? And so if it scales, then it must sort of then defer to some sort of upper register reality. And of course, in the case of the story of the Odyssey, the order that it reflects is the order of Olympus. This is Zeus's established order. And remember, Zeus is not the first order of the gods. He has actually displaced the order of the Titans. And he's had to do all kinds of politicking with other gods and other forces in order to overthrow his own father. But incumbent upon all those who follow in the Olympian order is that they must somehow adhere to this kind of ritual interaction, this kind of ritual play that, like I said earlier, it involves sort of a larger network of networked city states, right? Pylos and Ithaca and fill in the blank, all the different Greek city states, and of course, significantly, that in Homer's world, both in the Iliad and the Odyssey, there are no such thing as the Greeks, right? That they are called the Achaeans, and they're called other names, or they're just called like he's from Ithaca, he's from Pylos, he's from Sparta, he's from Athens, et cetera, right? There's no such thing as the Greeks. The Greeks, in my way of seeing it, the Greeks come together through their participation in the stories of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And the Iliad as its own sort of thing, and we can maybe have a different conversation there. But the Odyssey is essentially a kind of story through which and by which the Greeks become the Greeks. You might think of them as kind of formative scriptures, as these loose collection of tribes come into being. And of course, they're all ordered under this Olympian order. We continue.
Right? So it's obviously a scalable virtue. And maybe it's also the foundation of that societal trust that constitutes, I think, the only real natural resource. Could you speculate, do you think, on the relationship between hospitality and play? Like we talked about.
Yeah, throw an insight too.
Okay.
Okay. I will. I'll throw an insight too. I think this goes back to there seems to be evidence. The dating is questionable, somewhere between 120,000, 70,000 BCE. We're facing, it looks like, the possible end of the species. Like, it's under tremendous pressure. It's bottlenecking. And it looks like the innovation that we happened upon, again, you have to be careful because the evidence is very undetermined when you're talking about prehistory, but was expanded trade networks, where not only trade of good, but trade of information. So what seems to have happened is human beings figured out if they could create larger networks of information gathering and good distribution, they could deal with what looked like there might have been challenges to the food supply. We don't know. Now, the problem with that is, okay, how do you do that? How do you actually, like, you can't make it teleological. Well, we need to set up trade networks.
Right.
Yeah. And so one of the proposals, which I find very powerful and interesting, is that you need individuals who are capable of being liminal and willing to undergo significant self-transformation and move between worlds. And so you get the proposal of the invention, notice I'm doing it this way, of shamanism.
So, of course, John is being careful here, couching his terms and all of his language and these sort of terms that, fine. I love John. He's being careful, and he's the real deal. He's an academic, and he can't fly off half-cocked the way yours truly can fly off half-cocked. But I'll go ahead and do it. And so he talks about sort of this creation of the shaman figure. And the shaman figure, of course, is this liminal figure, this go-between figure. And of course, if you've read anything in the Old Testament, anything in the ancient world, liminal figures are holy figures, right? That they're the go-betweens. And of course, Moses is a perfect example of a shaman figure, a go-between, right? That he is this figure, permanently transformed, of course, by his interactions with the divine in such a way that he's sort of unrecognizable. You can't see his face and all these kinds of things. So permanently changed. But anyway, the point here is, I think what John is getting at is that these are liminal people, like through these networks. And these liminal people are both real or physical, we might say, but they also represent something that is sort of super physical or metaphysical. And these shaman figures are important because it not only connects or acts out a connection between the various tribes, but it also acts out a kind of relationship between the tribe and the order of gods, the tribe and, Athena, the tribe and Poseidon. And then of course it is through the tribe and Poseidon and this tribe and Athena and this tribe and so on and so forth. You have all of these sort of internetwork series of peoples, these sort of tribal city-state peoples that are ultimately forged together through this, the king of the gods, this politicking god Zeus. And Zeus is the one, sort of the Olympian order, through his orders, he demands hospitality, right? And if you look at the way that hospitality functions in the story, those characters who don't play by the rules are paid back, right? And so famously, of course, when Odysseus demands that the Cyclops Polyphemus treats him or gives him the order of xenia as demanded by Zeus, Polyphemus, the one who does not live in community. He's sort of a monster because he lives. Remember, Aristotle says at some point, I think early on in the Politics, if I'm not mistaken, that man's destiny lies in community, in the polis. Only gods or monsters can and exist outside of community. So that human beings have this sort of unique genius for community living. And if you don't abide by that, you're a god or you're a monster. And in the end, there's really no functional difference between gods and monsters. Remember, in the Greek world, gods are to be feared mightily. Anyway, I'm going to let John go again.
That what the shaman is good at is good at actually mediating between different perspectives and different groups. Mm-hmm. And what the shaman starts to do is you start to create.
Right. Well, he is a border dweller.
That's right. He's a border dweller.
Psychopomp. Yeah.
And I love Jordan talking about the border figure, the psychopomp. And of course, we remember that, the psychopomp is a soul conductor, a kind of soul guide. And so not only do the gods function in this capacity, but heroes and poets do as well. Right? That they are sort of the consummate figures that exist in multiple worlds at the same time. No mere mortal, but heroes are kind of this sort of in-between character. These psychopomps are in between characters. And of course, I want you to point out that look at the role that play or kayfabe might play in this ritualized liturgical dance of sorts.
Yeah, and he can move between communities,
Yes,
and he can negotiate it, and he can also deal with any of ways in which the foreigner has introduced social disharmony to the group, because that's one of his or her skills too, right? But what the shaman has to do, right, is the shaman has to somehow translate their capacity for like this cognitive flexibility into something that can be learned by other people. And the proposal is that we get the invention of important sets of rituals, that you get the invention of like something perhaps like even like the handshake.
Okay. So the creation of rituals, and he goes to its sort of most sort of rarefied version, which is the Western handshake. And if you know anything about the handshake, you know that is a very recent technology, the way that John is talking about it. It was English, I believe. It was sort of a way. But anyway, the handshake is, of course, an establishment of a certain kind of comportment to the other, and it is both a reestablishment of friendship, but it's also, the establishment of, hey, I come to shake your hand, not to bear the sword. And so we look at the way in which these rituals of play are engaged in. Now, significantly, in the opening book of the Odyssey, Athena requests to go take care of Telemachus, which is Odysseus's son. And of course, Odysseus's son is essentially grown up fatherless, and he is living as a prisoner in his own house because his esteemed mother Penelope is being pursued heavily by all sort of the local and semi-local suitors who wish to have Penelope's hand in marriage, because clearly Odysseus is dead, he's not coming back, he's been lost, etc., right? And so significantly, now we have to watch what happens in the story, because they're not going to sort of spell it out for you all the time. But Athena comes down, and she comes down in the guise of a traveler. And when she comes into the main house, the main courtyard area, and into the main hall of Odysseus's palace, the suitors ignore the stranger. In other words, they're too busy having their fun, and they're drinking, and they're eating, and they're carrying on. And it is Telemachus who recognizes that a stranger has come in to the the hall, and therefore, as again, he's the man of the house, but he's not really the man of the house, because his father it's unclear, it's ambiguous as to what has actually happened with Odysseus. And so it's unclear, because if he's the father of the house, then he needs to kind of move his mother on. It's all kinds of complexity. But my point, that's not my point. My point is that he recognizes that, well, look, somebody has to perform the proper rituals of xenia, right? And it's this dance. And so he goes up to this character, it's Athena in disguise, and he's like, oh, please welcome, please put this down and come in. And he does this whole thing, and please sit down, and you can wash, and you can do all these sorts of things. And then finally, after the washing and the eating and the drinking of the wine, then he says, who are you? Right. And notice, of course, that the question of identity is far after what we would just do as a handshake, right? That this whole ritual process, right? This sort of group game in which you're sort of fulfilling certain scripts, right? Not written out words like we would what do you call that? A screenplay, right? But you are fulfilling a sort of a pre-scripted role. And so Telemachus is playing the role as the man of the house, the host, and Athena in disguise is playing the role of the stranger. And of course, the reason why one of the sort of the assurances or the insurances of this Olympian order of xenia, this command for hospitality, is that you never know if the stranger coming to your house is actually a god in disguise. And of course, fascinating, and for our purposes, I think importantly, it is in fact a god in disguise. It's Athena. It is Zeus's daughter.
Which is a ritual which is designed to try and speed up the process by which you and I, who are strangers, might be able to recognize each other as at least potentially trustworthy. And then you have outward facing rituals like that, and then you have inward facing rituals of initiation. Like, okay, we have to tighten our identity. So we, like, in order to be willing to interact with them, we have to know clearly better who we are. And so you get the initiation rituals, you have like interaction rituals, and then in connection with that, you have rituals that have to do with enhancing the cognitive flexibility that makes that kind of ritual possible. Now, here's the connection. Ritual is play. It is a profound kind of play. Because what I'm doing in ritual is I'm engaging the imaginal. So the Corbin's distinction between the imaginary and the imaginal. So the imaginary is when I picture things in my mind and I'm taking myself away from reality. The imaginal is when when a child is playing at being Superman. They're not picturing Superman. They're, what's it like to look at the world like Superman? What is it like to try out this identity? That's what a ritualism.
All right. So hope I didn't ruin the sound on that bit. Sorry, I'm figuring this out, but really important. I love what John laid out right there. He's talking about, sort of this ritual, which is a kind of play, which is a play of memory. It is a play of interaction, and it is a play of connection, right? And so if we can think of Kayfabe, or this sort of this group interactive play, it is enforcing a kind of memory, right? It is engaging in a kind of a dance, of a kind of a ritualized liturgical dance of some sort, and which creates then a connection. And this is ritual play into the imaginal, right? And so in part, what we see here in the opening of the Odyssey is that Telemachus is learning how to be the man of the house, right? And in part, his piety, his goodness, his proto-heroism stems from his willingness to submit himself to this kind of ritual play, right? And it is the ritual play that the suitors, the haughty suitors, right, the arrogant, dismissive suitors, are either unwilling to do or have lost the thread, right? They have forgotten the assignment. And so I think this idea, and then of course this goes into the imaginal, right? And imaginal is not it is an inhabiting of a kind of persona, right? And so and you don't break face.
Ritual is a way of, what's it like, play, to serious play. What's it like to look at what's it like to look at this person as although they're a stranger, they're trustworthy. What's it like to be a person that can enter into recognition with you? And so I think there's
right, and then identity starts to become identity with the ability to do that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. That's identity with the hero, I think, rather than with the tyrannical father, let's say.
So I think there's I think hospitality, right, is a name for a set of rituals that were invented and discovered to deal with this problem of how do we expand our networks?
How do we expand our networks? I love that question, right? And so what so then this brings me back to sort of professional wrestling, right? And sort of you expand your networks because in part, I think we live in a world that has radically downplayed the notion of participatory knowing, right? That we truly believe that play is for kids, and we neglect the role that play plays in the formation of other structures, maybe even adult structures, in such a way because we are heavily suspect of play because we think it's fake, right? And if you look at the way that people, like whenever I prattle on about kayfabe on X or on YouTube, I'm immediately inundated with comments. It's like, well, it's fake, right? It's a lie, and it's not true, right? You would not go to the little kid who's playing, I don't know, Superman or Star Wars or what have you in the living room or in the sandbox or in the basement. You wouldn't go down and tell the kid, like, well, you're not really Superman. You're not really Darth Vader. You're not really, and fill in the blank, right? That's absurd. We wouldn't do that. Yet, and what the child seems to recognize is that this is kind of practice for being. And so, those folks trapped in a kind of modernist frame, have lost the ability for adult play, right? And so it finds its expressions in all kinds of strange ways and oftentimes pretty dark ways, right? Because in our lives, we have associated ritual play, liturgical play as child stuff, right? In fact, it's something that we should be deeply suspect of, right? Because it's fake and somebody's trying to sort of game us. And I would say quite the contrary, that our access to reality comes from our willingness to um, act together to generate the real, right? Just the way that, that I act, with my wife in order to generate a family, both physically and spiritually. And it is through the iterations of meals, it is through the iterations of prayer time, it is through the iterations of mass or church or synagogue or what have you, right? It is through those iterations. It is through the iterations of taking a walk. It is through the iterations of Christmas time, and it is the iterations of going to the beach, and all of these sort of ritual plays that we engage in. That's where I became dad, right? And I'm technically dad, I'm biologically dad, but what have I done? What have I acted into being by taking on the role of dad, right? And you may find yourself playing the role of a heel, you might find yourself in a role that you do not wish to play, and then of course you have to negotiate with the other adults, and have some deep conversations about the inadequacies of that. But my larger point, right, is that kayfabe is not fake, right? Kayfabe is the adoption of roles in sort of group meaning making. All right, let's watch this to the end. We're almost done here.
Yeah, well, it's got to be something like, let's say you're being hospitable to someone who's truly a stranger. You're treating them kindly. So you're treating them as if they're kin.
That's right.
And so what that means is that despite the evident differences, which might be racial, linguistic, and ethnic, let's say, so profound differences, you're making you're acting out the proposition when you're hospitable that there's a core identity that's shared. Right. And so that's got to be a transcendent identity, because the obvious identity markers are radically different.
So while it is the case that there is something happening at the level of the horizontal, you have more goods, you have more ideas. By the way, we could just take note of the strength of a protocol or a ritual over time and across contexts lets us know something about how important it is. So if we think about the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, how critical the hospitality protocol was.
Oh yeah,
right. Lot is willing to go to great lengths not to violate the protocol of hospitality. That tells us pay ultimate length. Ultimate length. That's right. Ultimate length. And so the vertical dimension, right, the fact that we are now able to enter into a state of communion by means of properly exercising this ritual, this protocol of engagement, to form a new identity that has completely new capacities and competencies that are an expansion in the vertical dimension as well as in the horizontal dimension. And that's that's the key unlock that enables everything.
Well, that's it's so cool that
And I think Jordan is exactly right, that the vertical dimension is the key of the unlock, right? Because in the story, right, in the Odyssey, it is the human beings who are willing to submit themselves to these structures of play, right, that ultimately flourish, right? So that when Odysseus finally shows up in the second half, like he finally gets home, but he recognizes that once you get home, home is kind of a corrupted place. In fact, it's polluted. It's a hot mess. And this is what happens when the man of the house leaves for almost 20 years. And so there was going to be a cost with that. And so Odysseus has to reclaim it. And it's great. Love the second half of the Odyssey. And it can be pretty brutal. But what happens is that the suitors have been impious. They have not submitted themselves to the vertical dimension of Zeus's command to be hospitable. Right? And so therefore, because the cost of that, right, in order to, is that they have polluted Odysseus's city. And so they have to be expunged. They have to be gotten rid of. He gives them an opportunity to perform those rituals. So he shows up in disguise. Remember, Athena shows up earlier in disguise. He shows up in disguise as a beggar. And Athena kind of does her sort of magic work on him and makes him look old and like a bum. Right. And so when he shows up, now, how are you supposed to treat the bum? Well, the corruption of this place is so bad that they actually, instead of serving the bum, right, instead of enacting the ritual play of xenia, they instead put together a fight. In fact, they set up a fight with the local bum, the sort of the normal bum that they've kind of abused, but they kind of keep around for amusement, which is totally gross and totally corrupt and ignoble, right? And they set up a fight between their bum and this new bum, which actually is Odysseus in disguise. Interesting, again, in this conversation about kayfabe, right? That we have then a truly fake fight that is set up between that's so cool, Odysseus and I forget his name off the top of my head. Sorry, it's been about a year since I've taught, 2 years since I've taught it. But anyway, here we are. And so, and Odysseus is like, look, you don't want to do this. In fact, he even goes up to the guy. He's like, dude, like, I'm not what you think I am. Like, I'm going to destroy you. And then the bum is like, oh, you want to play tough guy? And so he starts playing the role of like the baby face in wrestling terms. And Odysseus is like, fine, you want me to be the heel? I'll be the heel. And like demolishes the poor guy. Right. And it hurts him badly. So he has to go off and get himself nursed back into health. But notice, of course, that Odysseus is forcing these people to engage in a ritual that will damn them quite explicitly and lead to their own execution at the hands of Odysseus, Telemachus, and the swineherd and a couple of his friends, right? And of course, with the help of Athena. And so this enforcement of that divine vertical dimension is so crucial to the unfolding of the story. Let's just finish this out. I keep saying that.
Hospitality has that imaginal element. It's right. I'm going to treat this stranger as though they're welcome. Well, that's the question. On what basis?
Yeah.
But it's something like shared humanity. So it is the acting out of the concept of shared humanity before that's propositionalized at all.
So before you can have a propositional shared humanity, you have to instantiate, you have to play it, you have to act it into being, into reality, right? And so and it must somehow be enforced at that upper register. But notice that the proposition follows the real.
Or even not, because for Abraham, they weren't humans, right? They're angels.
Right. Well, I think that's partly pointing to the fact that the thing that you're actually establishing the hospitable relationship with is only human on the surface, right? That's a pointer, because we've already made the case that when you're hospitable to someone who's truly a stranger, you're removing from consideration all the obvious differences.
I love what Jordan said, that you're only human on the surface. And so therefore, you can see the genius of Xenia playing out in this story, because it is actually Odysseus in disguise, who is kind of like a half man, half god. Like, that's the whole idea of a hero. But then it could be Athena, it could be Zeus, it could be, fill in the blank, it could be Hermes, it could be, Apollo, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So that to play then is to sort of participate in something that is both from the divine but also through the real. Love that. It's so good. It's so good.
Yeah. But you're doing that in the realization that there's something, well, you could say in the context of that story, something divine underneath, that every stranger who comes your way is an angel in disguise. So
the god beneath or the gods above, right? It doesn't matter, right? It's sort of like it's in a participatory dimension beyond the merely physical, right? And so when my friends in compadres out there in this sort of sphere talk about kayfabe as fake, part of what they are, I think, missing is the way in which we fake things into reality, through the process of realization, right? I know Vervaeke talks a lot about relevance realization, but just cut off the relevance for a second, and it's like it's a divine realization, right? It is the invitation of the meta divine realm into the physical realm that makes things real. Sort of the divine idea precedes that which we make ritually together. Right. And it is this participatory quality of liturgy that I think we so miss as moderns, right? And I can complain about modernity all I want, and I can pretend like I'm not modern, but we're all moderns, right? We all live in this world that has been stripped of its its complexity and its depth. And of course, the power of stripping the world of its complexity and depth is you can manipulate it, right? You can do all kinds of things in this this in the discarded image, right? Once you discard the image, you can just throw everything around like a bunch of meat Legos, which is super powerful. But it is also a refusal to participate in the meta divine realm.
Something like
right.
that.
Yeah. Well, certainly that's what Christ says in the gospel.
You do proper hospitality as an ascendant coming.
Well, then you could also imagine that the more hospitable you are to someone, the more the angelic element of their nature is I noticed this in my clinical practice, that even with the worst people, like if you're engaged in a dialogue with someone who's hurt and bad, the best possible thing you can do is to listen and never say anything that's the least bit false. Because as soon as you do that, you're in their territory and you're not going to win that. Like that's a very bad, so that's a good thing for everybody watching and listening.
And therefore you could recognize that as soon as you sort of play that game, this other game, you're in the world of the suitors and they're more powerful than you and they're going to eat you or they're going to destroy you, right? And so you can kind of play in that world, but you sort of play in that world at your own peril.
Listening to know if you ever fall into the hands of someone truly dangerous, lying is a very bad idea. They're a lot better at it than you. So, all right, well, we should wrap up this part of the discussion.
And so I'll do the same, right? I really like this conversation with these three guys. I know a lot of people piled on because poor Jordan Hall didn't get a chance to talk. I don't have a subscription to the Daily Wire, and I couldn't even play that here because I would get a strike even so. But I want, again, I know why people have reservations about this notion of kayfabe, right? But I want to expand it out because I think it provides us with an insight into generative modes of being that we neglect at our own peril, right? I mean, after all, look, at the end of the day, like I'm a church guy, right? And so like, what exactly am I doing when I go to church on Sundays, right? And I'm Catholic, and so we go to the Mass and we hear the liturgy of the Word, and then we move into the liturgy of the Eucharist, and we're all like sitting in rows, and we're kind of looking up at the altar, and the priest is in these sort of these special outfits, these costumes, right? And he sort of we have the ritual in which the bread and the wine are kind of marched up the center aisle and they are received by the priest, and then they goes to the altar and he kind of does all these things and these ritual ablutions, and then he does the incense around the altar, and it's all of this. It's play, right? And I mean, look, I'm Catholic, right? I believe all this stuff, right? But I'm not. But it is essential for us to understand it as play, and it is group play, right? So the way that I participate in it is different from the way that a priest participates in it, which is different from the way that the altar server is participating in it. But all of us together are meaning making in concert with one another, and right. So it's all on this sort of this horizontal realm, which then also spikes with the vertical. Right. So that the elevation of the Eucharist, like this is sort of, we are making it real, right? And that it is participating in the now and in the eternal, like at the same time, right? So it's so important that we recognize that play is not something you merely do in a sandbox, but we are always playing, right? And we need to get used to the fact that play is not a bad word, right? That play is absolutely essential to making meaning. All right, folks, that's all I'm going to do today, almost 45 minutes in, which is a little bit longer than my normal videos. I hope you like this video. I want to do some more of these reaction videos because I listen to these things and I watch these things all the time and I always want to talk about it, but I'm trying to sort out the technology. I'm just not very good at this. Pausing and muting and all these kinds of things. I'm sure somebody could come in here and help me do this in a more efficient way. I just need a couple of knobs and buttons that I could press rather than pointing and clicking. But at any rate, if you enjoyed this, please hit the like and subscribe button and do that ritual play, right? Because here we are engaged in a kind of ritual dance, and it is somewhat kayfabe. I'm playing the role of Kale Zeldin right here, and I am having a good time doing it. So if you like this, please share it, leave a comment on below. And until next time, explore the underneath. Cheers.